Again, we're looking at John 13, verses 21 through 30, and this is just the continuation of the story. We all, I'm sure, are familiar with the story of Jesus washing his disciples' feet. And that is what we saw very recently, a few weeks back, last time I had the opportunity to preach, here at the beginning of chapter 13, where Jesus went around to each disciple and he did the most humiliating, most humbling thing, most humbling act of service that really could be done at that time. He washed their feet and he gave them an example of how they should serve one another. And now it leads us into verses 21 and following. Throughout history, we see many examples, many stories of people betraying someone who trusts them, or of people betraying their country. One of the most famous examples of betrayal is the ancient Roman senator Brutus, who betrayed Julius Caesar around 40 years before the birth of Christ. And who was Brutus? Again, he was a senator. He was someone who believed in the republic, the representative form of government for the Roman Empire. And he also cared about his emperor, Julius Caesar. However, Julius Caesar made it evident that he didn't want to just be kind of at the head. He wanted to be the dictator. He wanted to have all the control. And while there still might be a Senate, the Senate would not really have much power or control at all. Now, even though Caesar saw Brutus as a friend and ally, Brutus decided to conspire against Caesar with several other senators, around 22 senators. And they got in the same room with Caesar, and they each stabbed Caesar. So Caesar was stabbed out 23 times. And we've all heard the famous phrase, when Brutus stabbed Caesar, Caesar turns and says, "Et tu, Brutus? You as well, Brutus. Are you also one of these ones?" Or, as one scholar thinks, Caesar might have been saying, "You too, Brutus," as in, as you did to me, it's going to happen to you too, which is an interesting thought. However, we have here this example of treachery, this example of treason, this example of betrayal. But ironically, Brutus did that so that he could preserve the representative form of government. However, his fellow Romans did not see it that way. His fellow Romans were swayed by Mark Antony and others, and they ended up seeing Brutus and his conspirators as the enemy, as the traitors. And so they were eventually defeated there, and Roman history continued. Now, even though this is a very famous betrayal, you can think of others. Benedict Arnold in this country, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. We can go on down the line of famous traitors throughout history. These are not the most famous. The most famous betrayal in history happened right here in our Bibles. Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, in his betrayal of Jesus Christ. So in this passage, we see the beginnings of the most famous betrayal in history, or what we might say is the point of no return. We know that Judas was already thinking about this. We know he was already conspiring to do this. But it is in this passage, at this moment, when we see the point of no return. And as we read earlier, Satan entered into him. Once that happened, it was over. It was as good as done. It just needed a few more hours for the actual action, the actual deed to occur. Though Jesus did nothing wrong at all, Judas decided to turn him over to the Jews for what? A little bit of money. 30 pieces of silver. But unlike Julius Caesar, Jesus knew all about the betrayal. It was not a surprise to him. And Jesus, get this, even encouraged it to happen, as we will see in this passage, because it was the will of his Father that he be betrayed and that he be crucified for the sins of the world. So here, what do we see? We see Jesus, sharing his heart with his disciples, and we see him encouraging them to embrace the heart and lifestyle of a servant. He challenges them to recognize that they are in a spot of humility, a spot of service. That is what God calls us all to do, to be servants, to serve God, to serve others, to do that because we've been transformed by the gospel of Jesus Christ. This powerful teaching, though, is interrupted, as we see here in this passage, by the presence of the traitor in the room, Judas Iscariot. And in this passage, we see Jesus turns his teaching to his coming betrayal. And the first thing that we'll see here in our passage today is that we must follow the Father's will, even when it means great emotional pain. We must follow the Father's will, even when it means great emotional pain. As we look here at this passage, looking just right now at verse 21, if you'd like to look at it with me, John writes, "After saying these things, Jesus was troubled in his spirit and testified, 'Truly, truly, I say to you, one of you will betray me.'" So we see here in this passage that Jesus became greatly moved emotionally. As it says here, Jesus was troubled in his spirit. He was stirred up inside. All right, that word is the idea of being stirred up. You think of a pool of water being stirred up and bubbling, visibly visible movement there. That is how Jesus is feeling. He is very emotionally moved. John records other examples of Jesus being moved. We just think of the death and resurrection of Lazarus, where Jesus wept. Jesus was a very emotional person. He was not just some sort of robot always thinking, I know what's going to happen, I'm just going to do this, on to the next thing. No, Jesus was a human being, 100%. He was fully moved by the curse and its effects and what was about to happen to him. So we see here that Jesus was not completely at peace. You know, we can sometimes think in our minds of Jesus as someone who, just filled with the Spirit, calmly going from one trial, one event to the next, to the next, to the next. That was not Jesus. Now, of course, was he moved in the Spirit? Absolutely. Was he sinless? Absolutely. But we see here that he was not completely at peace. He was struggling. We see that Jesus struggled greatly with what was about to happen to him. I think we're going to need to quiet a device back there, if you can, please. I appreciate it. Rather than holding things in, also we see that Jesus utters yet another truly, truly statement. And he declares what he is so disturbed about. One of those whom he is closest to and has invested so much time in and energy into is going to hand him over to the Jews to be crucified. And we see that here in this passage. So we see here that whenever Jesus says, truly, truly, he's trying to emphasize something. He is trying to say, look, I'm not just saying truly once, I'm saying it twice. And I'm not just trying to make a point by just saying the point by itself. I really want you to get this. Truly, truly, I say to you. And what does Jesus say? One of you will betray me. Jesus isn't just, let's say you get a junk mail, an offer for a credit card, or you rent a car and you have to sign the documents for renting a car. What do you always have on these? Lots and lots of fine print, right? Jesus here isn't saying something to just say it so he can, perform the will of the Father by saying it, but it doesn't really matter if his disciples get it or not. He wants them to know this. He's not just trying to slide this in there for one reason or another. He wants them to recognize that one of those 12 people in that room is figuratively going to stab him in the back. And it's someone that he has spent so much time and effort in, probably precious moments of teaching and learning, of serving. Just, a family member basically is going to turn him over. And we know that John is basically the only gospel to repeatedly use the phrase truly, truly. Other passages, other gospels will say truly, use the word once. But John, there's an emphasis on truth. There's an emphasis on this is what is true. And so this is one more item in the Gospel of John that emphasizes truth. Truly, truly, repeating that phrase. And interestingly enough, John records that Jesus uses this 4 times in just this chapter. 4 times. And I think one of the things you can draw from that, again, is the stage of Jesus' life and ministry, all right, and the emotional impact this is having on him. He now wants to drive home point after point after point to his disciples at this time. His ministry is coming to a close. He's speaking with greater directness. He's emphasizing that the disciples need to pay attention. Now, as I was studying through this passage, meditating on this passage, the thought occurred to me, and I think this question has arisen in my mind before. Why did Jesus need to be betrayed? Couldn't Jesus have just walked up to the temple? Couldn't he have just walked into the Roman fortress there and said, "Here I am. I know you want to kill me. Let's get it over with"? But that is not what happened. That is not what the Father wanted to happen. We know that it was prophesied that he would be betrayed. Psalm 41, verse 9, the one who was in my house and so forth has lifted his heel against me, has taken my bread, has lifted his heel against me. So we know that betrayal is already something that was prophesied. But why did it have to happen? I don't know that I know the full answer, but I'm guessing that it has something to do with the nature of Old Testament sacrifice. Think back to any given Jew going to the tabernacle, going to the temple to offer a sacrifice. That person had to bring or buy a lamb or a goat or a bull, whatever it was he was sacrificing, or even a drink offering. Had to actually physically bring those things to the priest and betray them over to the priest to be killed. I believe that the hand of the sinner needed to voluntarily, willingly hand over that sacrifice for it to be legitimate. And that is why I personally think, at least one factor, as to why Jesus needed to be betrayed. He couldn't just because you think back to these Old Testament sacrifices, you don't have a given sheep or goat wandering by itself into the tabernacle or the temple and then walking right up to the priest, and the priest does say, "I'm guessing you are, let's see, what's the tag on your ear? Oh, you're for Joseph. Yes. All right, here's Joseph's sacrifice. Let's go get this over with." No, it was a handing over. It was a delivering over. That word for betray literally means deliver over. And so here we have the fact that the Messiah, the sacrifice for the world, needed to be delivered over so that he could be the salvation, the sacrifice to provide salvation for the sins of the world. That way he was a legitimate sacrifice. And so as we see here, this very emotionally moving time where Jesus is almost beside himself, we see that for us, we should do the same. Jesus was on his Father's path. He was going to do his Father's will. There was no doubt about that, but it didn't mean it wasn't difficult for him. We must follow the Father's will, even when it means great emotional pain. Now, how does that strike you? As a member, basically, of the culture of the United States of America and similar cultures around the world as well, how does that strike you? Because in our culture, we put a pretty big emphasis on doing what? On avoiding emotional pain, of dealing with it to get rid of it, of medicating it. All right, emotional pain is, let's not deal with that. Obviously, it happens, but we wouldn't want to talk about it, happening. We don't, and definitely we don't want to do anything that would cause it, right? We're trained to think that we must avoid emotional pain at all costs. And if we have a choice, we're likely going to choose the path of least emotional pain. Because in the religion of the civilized world, we all want to be comfortable. And comfort is the most important thing, unfortunately. Now, as we look at this passage, though, that is not what Jesus did. He chose the path of not just a little emotional pain. He chose the path of the greatest emotional pain. Not so that he could prove his toughness, although he was the toughest human to ever live. Not so that he could show off to others, although, we obviously admire what Jesus did. Not so that not because he hated himself. Some people say, "Oh, Jesus, he just had self-loathing." No, that wasn't it either. but because the path of emotional pain was the path of obedience. It was the path of love. It was the path of ultimate success. There are times when we have to make a similar decision in our lives. Though the stakes of our decision can never compare to Jesus' decision, we may have to choose to separate ourselves from someone that we want to be around, which will then cause emotional pain, because the Bible is full of passages and examples of where we should not associate closely with the ungodly, because that then affects our own walk with God, our own spiritual condition. It's painful to say, I'm sorry, I can't associate with you like this. I want to talk with you, I want to continue the relationship, but we can't be involved in this type of sin together. I can't be encouraged to do this type of wrong thing. We have to change the relationship until, of course, you accept Christ and follow him. That's painful. That's emotionally painful. We might have to separate ourselves from something that we really enjoy doing, but it is, again, a bad influence on our spiritual maturity. We have to have God's will so ingrained in our thinking that it is far worse to disappoint and disobey God than it is to suffer emotionally. How do we get there? How do we, in our fallenness, get to that point? We get there by continually meditating on God, worshiping God, meditating on his word, continually preaching the gospel to ourselves. We must follow the Father's will, even when it means great emotional pain. The next thing we see in this passage is in the next few verses, we see that we must follow the Father's will, even when it means that those closest to us don't understand our explanations of what we're planning to do. We see here now verses 22 through 25, if you'd like to look at them with me. Verse 22, the disciples looked at one another, uncertain of whom he spoke. Who is it that's going to betray him? One of the disciples, whom Jesus loved, was reclining at table close to Jesus. So Simon Peter motioned to him to ask Jesus of whom he was speaking. So that disciple, leaning back against Jesus, said to him, Lord, who is it? We must follow the Father's will, even when it means that those closest to us don't understand what we're saying, don't understand our explanations. We see here, first of all, the disciples, once again, they were not plugged into Jesus' thinking. This is a common theme throughout the Gospels, right? Time and time and time again, the disciples are clueless. They don't get it. They're not on board. Again, highlighting the great patience of Jesus in continuing to disciple them. That's a whole new sermon by itself, right? How discipleship takes patience in bringing people along. So you can picture what is going on in this room as you see Jesus drop this bombshell on them. One of you is a traitor. And they're just looking around. You can picture, right now we have a pretty quiet room. And if I said something like this to you, one of you is going to murder me in an hour. Who is it? Is it Josh? Is it Pastor Ben? Is it Joe? Who's going to do it? And you're just stunned. You're like, no, there's no one here capable. Obviously, we're all humans. We're capable of horrible things. But no one's going to do that. And they're all looking around trying to figure out what is going on here. Who could it be? See if anyone has any idea who Jesus could be referring to. And if the disciples want to know who Jesus is talking about, they will have to ask him, right? Because no one has a clue. So it's at this point that John, the author, John the apostle, mentions himself in the story. Again, look with me at these verses. Verse 23, one of his disciples, whom Jesus loved, was reclining at table close to Jesus. This is John the apostle. This is John, the author of this book. This is not John the Baptist. This is John the apostle. And we know this is John because this connects to chapters 20 and 21, where he clearly reveals that he is the one whom Jesus loved, and so on and so forth. But he speaks of himself in the third person. Again, a writing, literary tactic that he decides to use here under the power of the Holy Spirit, as the Spirit inspires these very words. And where was the one who Jesus loved? He was right beside Jesus. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this as well, but again, this here is the Christian life, right? Being close to Jesus, being one that loves Jesus and one whom Jesus loves. Now, do you think Jesus loved all the disciples? Absolutely, he loved all the disciples. But it's very clear here, John says, I'm the one that Jesus loved. You almost wonder, there's a little bit of humor going on there. But there was this very special relationship between John and Jesus. So, what is John doing here? How does he factor into this part of the story? He was reclining at table close to Jesus. So Simon Peter is the most well-known of the disciples. But interestingly enough, he was not close to Jesus. He was somewhere else at the table. Again, I want you to picture what this would have looked like. This would have been probably a collection of about 3 very low tables. They were very low to the ground. Not like the Last Supper painting that we have all seen. All right, this would have been like probably a U-shaped set of tables. And then around this U-shaped set of tables, you would have had the 12 disciples, each of them with their head, each of them reclining, likely on their left side, resting on their left elbow, and their head would have been at the table, so they could then use their right hand to reach out and get the food, and their feet would have been spreading out like spokes away from this U-shaped table. So we see here that John was very close to Jesus, and I would argue he was on this side of Jesus. So he was beside Jesus' right hand, but he was actually on the left side of Jesus. And Peter was somewhere else. So we see that he was close to Jesus, and then Simon Peter motioned to him. How would Peter have done this? Probably just nodded. I mean, everyone in the room wanted to know the same thing, and Peter probably got eye contact with John, and probably just said something like, ask him. What you're right there. Ask him what's going on. And that is exactly what happens. So that disciple leaning back against Jesus. Again, we have this emphasis on John being close to Jesus. So think of each person being a spoke on this wheel, so to speak, of this U-shaped table formation. All right, Jesus is here on his left elbow, and you have John right here doing the same thing. Now, what would have been the easiest comfortable way for John to ask Jesus this question in a semi-private way? Simply for John to kind of roll back and lean back against Jesus, so he could be very close to Jesus and ask him, who is it? So this would have been a very quiet, almost secretive conversation that was going on. And so I feel that as this is happening, it's interesting that Peter does not ask Jesus himself. Right? Peter is always the most outspoken one. Why didn't Peter just say, who is it? I mean, he's great at putting his foot in his mouth time after time after time. But there was something going on here. I don't know if it was the culture of this meal, where only the people closest to the host could do the talking, or there had to be some sort of order in the speaking, or if it was just the emotional weight of the room where Peter just did not want to raise his voice at this time. So he motioned for John to do it. And we see that John then asks the question of Jesus, because again, he was the closest to Jesus. He was there, always there, close to Jesus. He was the disciple that Jesus loved. And again, while I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on that, that is where we should strive to be. We should strive to be the ones that love Jesus and that Jesus loves us. We know that Abraham was called the friend of God because there was a close relationship there. We also should desire to have that close relationship with Jesus. We must follow the Father's will, even when it means that those closest to us don't understand our explanations of what is going on. So there will be times when God calls us to do something that doesn't make sense to others. Have any of you been there? Maybe some of you here. I know some of you go to a Christian college. Has there been someone, a friend of yours, a relative, who said, "Why are you going to that school?" They don't understand. They don't understand, and you say, "Well, this is why I'm going. X, Y, Z," and they don't understand your explanation. They don't understand your big life decisions that you are making because you want to follow Jesus Christ. And with any big life decision, we tell people, right? We tell our family, we tell our friends, we might tell our work associates, our neighbors, whoever we come in contact with and strike up a conversation with about what we're doing, what we're going to do. But God's way of life is often different from the unbelieving culture. And as you explain things like how you're going to choose a lower paying job so that you can have more time for serving Christ and serving in His church, or how you're going to move to not so great an area so that you can minister, be more faithful in service to your church family, or how you can help people there, or how you're going to marry someone that doesn't come from a wealthy family because you have found someone instead who loves God, or maybe how you're not going to lash out in anger and vengeance towards a certain person who wronged you. People don't understand that many times because they don't have the values of Christ. They're not filled with the Spirit. And as you explain these things, some people, again, they're not going to understand you, and they're going to push back at you even. They will disagree with you. They may ridicule you and, of course, discourage you. But the unbeliever, and even some immature believers, again, they do not value God's will as He calls us to value it. And that's why we must be close to Christ, so that we can very quickly, easily, comfortably have that communion with Him. So as John was close to Jesus, as he loved Jesus and Jesus loved him, so should we. We should let that love guide our actions, even when people don't understand it, even when we try to explain it to them. We must follow the Father's will, even when it means that those closest to us do not understand our explanations. We are now at verse 25, and looking at my notes here, it's a little bit ways before I get to the end of this message. I think I'm going to go ahead and pause our time here. I'm going to encourage you to think on what we have already looked at in these verses. There's so much that we have seen here that God is teaching us. And we're going to move to our time of communion now. So, Lord willing, next time I preach, I'm going to continue this message, and we'll see how this passage continues and see all the way up to the end, because I know I'm leaving you in suspense. Even though you have your Bibles here, you know what happens. Hopefully that will bring you back next time as we look at this passage again, likely in a couple weeks. So as we are closing our time in this passage right now, I do want to give you a preview of what we will look at. The next thing we'll see in the next few verses, that we must follow the Father's will, even if it means bringing significant suffering upon ourselves. Not just emotional, but holistic suffering. And then the last thing, we must follow the Father's will, even when those close to us don't understand what we are doing as well. And I believe that the main idea of this passage is simply this, that since Jesus willingly participated in His Father's will, so must we, even when it means that we will suffer. Even when it means that we will suffer. Suffering is a way of life for everybody. Doesn't matter whether you're an unbeliever or a believer, you will suffer. Suffering is a way of life. But do you want that suffering to actually mean something? Do you want it to actually lead you into greater life, to greater joy, to greater closeness with God, the God who loves you and has saved you?